So I thought I'd talk about autoimmunity today. It is a big subject, but I wanted today just to start with raising some awareness. Not everybody knows what it is, and those that do have it will concur that it doesn't necessarily arrive like a big bang overnight, and actually it's a long time in the making. And diagnosis of an autoimmune condition is actually quite long and therefore frustrating. I mean, I personally was poorly for quite a long time, sore throats, headaches, generally feeling run down, tired, always getting this bug and that bug, just basically a poor immune system. And I had many, many trips to my doctor. And unfortunately, he was quite abrupt, quite stern, and I actually began to feel like a hypochondriac. And eventually I stopped going to the doctors. And I finally got to a point where I was so poorly I had to go back to the doctors, and he said, "Oh, your neck's quite swollen, let's do a test for an underactive thyroid." So I did the test. I got confirmation that I did indeed have an underactive thyroid. He gave me levothyroxine, a tablet which I needed to take every day for the rest of my life, and sent me on my way. But unfortunately, over the next 10 years, I became progressively more poorly. I'd have good weeks and bad weeks, but overall I was declining, until I found myself 10 years later feeling very, very poorly indeed, and actually culminated in an anxiety attack, my first anxiety attack, and I went to see a new doctor. And when she offered me antidepressants, I was quite annoyed, and I walked out of there and started to do my own research, and that's when I learned that 90% of us with an underactive thyroid, it's actually autoimmune. And at that point, I asked my doctor to let me know whether or not it was autoimmune, and she looked back at the blood test and told me that it was. So the point that I'm trying to get across here is that Western medicine doesn't really care about autoimmunity. All they wanted to do was treat the part of my body that had been attacked, so for me, my thyroid, and give me a drug to replace that function that I'd lost as a result of the attack from the autoimmune condition. But they didn't want to address the autoimmune element of it. In fact, they paid no attention to it whatsoever. That was my GP and my endocrinologist, which is a thyroid specialist. Not one of them was interested in the autoimmune element. But through my own reading and just my own mind, I decided that, well, if my body was attacking my own body, surely something is triggering that. And if there's a trigger, if I can find out what it is, then perhaps I can stop the attack on my thyroid, and that would stop the function of my thyroid declining over the rest of my life. So as you can see from this, I had quite a long road to actually getting a diagnosis. It was only when I asked, and even when I got confirmation, they really weren't that interested. So I could sit here and be resentful about that, but actually I've come to embrace all of my history, all of my journey, because it's allowed me to now be sat here talking to you, sharing with you what I've learned so that you don't have to suffer in the way that I did. So I want to give you a few facts around autoimmune illnesses, and that is that 6 to 10, that's the number of different doctors a person will visit before they finally get diagnosed with an autoimmune condition. And that's because the symptoms are largely so disparate and so vague. And in a minute, I will run through some of the symptoms that you might experience if you are having an autoimmune condition but it's not yet been, diagnosed. 5 is the number of years it usually takes to get an official autoimmune diagnosis. So as I said earlier, a very long and frustrating journey before you finally get the diagnosis. And when you do get the diagnosis, they then treat you with meds to treat the symptom, but they don't actually work on, stopping the autoimmune attack. 50 million, this is an American stat, I'm afraid, but 50 million is the number of people that are living in the US with an autoimmune condition. That's almost 1 in 6 people. So this is very common. And a lot of those people, these people have been diagnosed. There are a lot of people in that 5-year period that have yet to be diagnosed. 70% is the amount of your immune system which is found in your gut-associated lymphoid tissue. So I always talk about 70 to 90% of your immune system resides in your gut, and I will talk a bit about why that's so important in a minute. But first, I just wanted to bring to your attention how many different autoimmune illnesses there are. So I've printed them out. You can see this in blue here. I'm going over to a third page. and then to a fourth page. There are a huge number of autoimmune illnesses. I'm going to read out a few here, the ones that I can pronounce mostly. So Addison's disease, alopecia areata, there's loads on here which I can't actually pronounce. Castleman disease, celiac disease, chronic inflammatory demyelating polyneuropathy. This is testing me, this is. What else have we got on here? Congenital heart block, Crohn's disease, dermatitis, endometriosis, fibromyalgia, Graves' disease, Guillain-Barré syndrome, Hashimoto's, that's the name of my thyroid condition. We have got juvenile arthritis, juvenile diabetes, juvenile myositis. We have got Lynchian sclerosis, Lyme, lupus, Meniere's disease, I hope I said that correctly. We've got multiple sclerosis, narcolepsy. I didn't know that was an autoimmune condition, actually. We have got so many on here that I can't actually pronounce. Psoriasis, Raynaud's phenomenon, reactive arthritis, restless leg syndrome. A lot of people in the group mention that often. Rheumatic fever, rheumatoid arthritis, sarcoidosis, scleroderma, hope I pronounced that correctly, stiff person syndrome, type 1 diabetes, ulcerative colitis, and vitiligo. So there's just a small handful of an example of different autoimmune illnesses, but I've printed them all out here and they run over 4 pages. So there are many, many different types of them. And the people suffering of those have typically waited 5 years to get a diagnosis and have seen between 7 and 10 doctors in order to arrive at that diagnosis. So now I want to talk a little bit about the symptoms that you might experience that you should be looking out for and be paying attention to if you have a diagnosed autoimmune condition, but also if you suspect or in the lead up to a diagnosis, this is what you might experience. So headaches, I had those. Anxiety, I had that. Brain fog, I also had that. Attention deficit problems. Body rashes, red bumps on the facial skin and flaking skin, I had those. Acne, had that. Rosacea, eczema, I had that. Psoriasis, dermatitis, joint pain, allergies. I have so many of those, or had not as many as I used to. Asthma, I also had that. Not taken an inhaler in 4 years now. Dry mouth, frequent colds, that was always me. Thyroid issues, as I say, they didn't tell me that my underactive thyroid was actually autoimmune, so they just don't tell you. So just because you've been told you've got a thyroid condition, it doesn't mean it's not autoimmune. The reality is that 90% of people with an underactive thyroid, it actually is autoimmune. And if it's overactive, then it is Graves' disease. Fatigue and hyperactivity, I definitely had that. Weight loss and gain, I had both. General feeling of malaise, that just feeling tired and not really got a lot of energy. Anxiety, muscle pain and weakness. I had horrendous knots in my shoulders, and I also had weakness and numbness down my arms, and particularly in this right hand, in my little finger. Feeling wired but tired. Oh, I had that all the time. It was like I was physically exhausted, but my brain was just going constantly. Exhaustion, another one I had. Digestive tract upset, might indicate irritable bowel disease or IBS. Stomach cramping, I had that. Gas, I had that. Bloated stomach, I had that. Diarrhea, I had that. And constipation, I had that. So there are a lot of different symptoms, which leads us to understand why it's so difficult to get that diagnosis, because many of those symptoms can relate to many different illnesses. The thing to be aware of is that when you have one autoimmune condition, you therefore have the right environment for other autoimmune conditions to take place or take hold. And so it's really important that we get a hold of this, the reason, the triggers as to why we have an autoimmune condition, so that we don't develop other ones. It's not unusual for people to have a collection or a basket of autoimmune illnesses. It's quite uncommon, I think, to have just the one. At least it might be that we are aware of one, but typically there are other ones there as well. And when I talked about the right conditions for an autoimmune condition to happen, then largely that comes down to gut health. So you might have heard of leaky gut. I talk about this often. It's also known as intestinal permeability. And I don't want to gross you out, but our intestines are like a mesh, and there are a number of things which I'll explain in a minute which can create holes in that mesh. So those holes get bigger and bigger, and that's called leaky gut. So we've basically got little junctures in our intestines, and they should be keeping things tight so that the food that we eat can be digested properly and the vitamins and the minerals get absorbed. But when you've got holes in your intestines, then actually food leaks into your bloodstream, and this can promote an immune response, hence autoimmune, but also it can create inflammation, which is why you might get the achy joints and the fever type thing. And so the things that can create those holes in your intestines or increase the size of those holes include overuse of antibiotics, which of course you might get in the lead up to an autoimmune condition because we're constantly feeling ill. I certainly had way too many antibiotics. Emotional distress. So they say we have a second brain in our stomach. You know, when you get nervous, you get tummy ache. So you can see how an emotional disturbance such as, you know, relationship breakup, the loss of a loved one, work stress or financial stress upsets the state of your digestive system. And food intolerances. So foods that you're eating that you might actually assume are good for you could be causing you a problem. So I wasn't able to eat sweet potatoes, broccoli, kale, maple syrup, which is actually just pure unrefined sugar tapped straight out of the tree, so nothing processed there. I couldn't eat these foods for a while, so they were seemingly healthy but causing a problem for me. And just generally eating a high sugar, high saturated fat, highly processed diet is bad for the health of our digestive system. And it's very important that we fix our guts in order to prevent, but also reduce the impact of any autoimmune conditions that we might have. And I have been successful in doing that. So the medical industry would probably dispute the fact that I say I've put myself into remission. But as it stands, I am symptom-free on a daily basis, but only because I manage my illness now. It is something that I will have for the rest of my life. And if I went back to my old lifestyle, I am absolutely certain that I would be completely and utterly be brought down by the symptoms of my autoimmune condition. But I am symptom-free because I have taken steps in order to reverse my autoimmune condition effectively. So you don't have to take my word for it. There are some studies done in respected medical journals such as Lancet, the British Medical Journal, and the International Journal of Gastroenterology. And they all suggest that leaky gut is the cause of autoimmune conditions, but also many other health conditions such as allergies, autism, depression, eczema, psoriasis, and probably many, many more diseases that we have yet to connect it to, and which are many only now being considered an autoimmune condition. I mean, I've just talked about that long list of autoimmune conditions, and some of those I didn't know were autoimmune, if I'm honest with you, which was a surprise to me. So I think it's very important that we look after our gut health, which is why I'm always talking about things like bone broth, collagen, kefir, kombucha, lots of leafy green vegetables to populate the good bacteria in our stomach and to keep the bad bacteria at bay. Now, I've read out the list of all of the different symptoms that you might be experiencing, and lots of people will just say, oh, that's just the way that I am. I just get headaches, or I just get stomachache, or I just get bloating after eating. But it is not just the way that you are. This is your body giving you symptoms, giving you signs, telling you that something is wrong. And if we ignore those signs that the body is giving us, then it will start to shout a bit louder. And if we still don't listen, it will start to scream at us. And eventually, because I ignored those signs and those symptoms, not helped by a very abrupt doctor that was pretty unsympathetic, I got myself to a point where my body was absolutely screaming at me to do something. You know, chronic fatigue, hair loss, weight gain initially. Then I lost a lot of weight, lost a lot of muscle, digestive issues, constantly bouncing between constipation and diarrhea. I'd often feel very sick at about 9 or 10 o'clock at night. I was very wired, but also exhausted. And that's just a few of the symptoms that I was experiencing. But my body was literally screaming at me. Chronic fatigue, you know, that lead feeling down your arms. I was basically stuck in my house for 6 whole months, which is miserable. And it's not something I ever wish to repeat again. But these are signs that our body is giving us. And if we don't pay attention, it will make sure that we do by shouting even louder. So leaky gut, which is at the root of autoimmune conditions, plus many other health conditions, generally starts out as a bit of inflammation. You know, so you might have bloating, constipation, discomfort, gas, trapped wind. And over time, this gets worse and worse and worse. The state of our digestive tract gets poor, and then we start to not be able to absorb our vitamins and minerals from our food properly. And what you might also find is that you get food and chemical intolerances. So, for example, perfumes used to bring me out in a rash. The smell of bleach would really do me in. And I had multiple food intolerances. And these all built up over time. Pollens, grasses. The number of things that I became intolerant to, sensitive to, or allergic to was increasing rapidly as I progressed through my illness. But there is something that we can do about this. As I say, I'm symptom free now, so it is possible to reverse this. And that is looking after our gut health, taking supplements where necessary, and generally changing our lifestyle to make sure that we get enough sleep, that stress is low, that we are relaxing, and that we are looking after our mental health. Thank you for watching my video. If you found that useful, why not subscribe to my channel, and don't forget to push the notification button so that you'll be alerted anytime I post a new video, so that you won't miss out on my top tips for living a happy, healthy, productive and stress-free life.